The 1960s in the United States were a decade of revolution, awakening, and resistance. Across the country, voices long silenced by oppression began to rise in unity against injustice. The civil rights movement was in full force. African Americans were marching for equality, Chicanos were demanding fair treatment, and women were breaking barriers of silence. But amid this atmosphere of protest and reform, one community's voice was still often unheard: the Native Americans. For centuries, they had faced forced removal, broken treaties, cultural erasure, and poverty. Yet, by the late 1960s, a spark of resistance began to burn once more, one that would soon become a roaring fire of pride and defiance: the American Indian Movement, known simply as AIM. The roots of AIM lay in the cities, not the reservations. By the 1950s and 1960s, many Native Americans had been forced into urban centers due to the U.S. government's termination and relocation policies. These programs promised jobs and modern opportunities but instead led to poverty, discrimination, and cultural disconnection. Native families who moved to cities like Minneapolis, Denver, or San Francisco found themselves in slums, without stable work, and far from the community support they once knew. The government had tried to solve the Indian problem by dissolving tribal governments and pushing Native people to assimilate, but what it really did was deepen despair. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, a group of Native men and women began to see the pattern clearly. They watched their brothers and sisters getting arrested unjustly, harassed by police, and locked up without cause. Many young Native men were being targeted on the streets, accused of crimes for simply existing. Among these observers were Dennis Banks, Clyde Belcourt, and George Mitchell, all of whom had seen firsthand the cruelty of the system. They were tired of being ignored, tired of being told they no longer existed as a people, tired of watching their children lose their traditions and their dignity. In 1968, they decided enough was enough. They founded the American Indian Movement in Minneapolis, a grassroots organization meant to protect the rights of Native people, especially in the cities. But AIM was not just another community program, it was a declaration of survival. Its early purpose was clear: to monitor police activity, expose injustice, and demand fair treatment for Native Americans. Volunteers patrolled the streets, recording incidents of police brutality and providing support for those who had been unfairly detained. This effort was modeled after similar patrols organized by the Black Panther Party, and soon it became a symbol of empowerment for urban Native communities. AIM's earliest members saw their work as more than civil rights activism; it was a fight for the soul of their people. The Native community had been fractured by centuries of U.S. policy designed to erase them. Their children were still being sent to. By 1972, the American Indian Movement had grown beyond anything its founders imagined. What began as a local initiative to protect Native people in Minneapolis had transformed into a national force demanding justice. Across the United States, Native Americans were uniting under AIM's banner, tired of the same lies, broken promises, and systemic oppression that had haunted their ancestors for centuries. The movement had lit a fire in Indian country, a fire that would soon blaze across the nation's capital and the heart of America itself. The 1970s marked a turbulent era in U.S. history. The Vietnam War, civil rights battles, and anti-establishment sentiment had exposed deep cracks in American democracy. For Native people, these cracks had always been wide and unhealed. More than 370 treaties had been signed between Native nations and the U.S. government, each one promising land, rights, and respect, and nearly all of them had been broken. Tribes continued to suffer under federal policies that stripped away sovereignty, destroyed sacred lands, and neglected their basic needs. In response, AIM and other Native organizations began planning a massive cross-country demonstration to bring attention to these injustices. The event was called the Trail of Broken Treaties, a deliberate reference to the countless treaties violated by the United States over the centuries. The goal was to unite Native voices from all over the country in a peaceful protest that would end in Washington, D.C., with a formal list of demands for the federal government. In October 1972, caravans of Native activists began their journey. Hundreds of cars, vans, and buses departed from different parts of the country: California, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Oklahoma, and beyond. They carried elders, warriors, women, and children, all united under a single vision of sovereignty and justice. Along the way, they stopped in native communities to rally support and share stories of pain and resilience. Each stop reignited old wounds, stories of stolen land, lost language, and cultural erasure, but also renewed strength. When the caravans finally reached Washington, D.C., in early November, the marchers carried with them a powerful document, a 20-point position paper that detailed their demands. Among them were calls for the restoration of treaty rights, the abolition of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, and the recognition of native sovereignty as defined by their own laws and traditions. The demands were radical to some, but, to Native people, they were a long overdue acknowledgement of their humanity. However, upon arrival, things did not go as planned. The government failed to provide adequate housing for the demonstrators, who were promised accommodations in Washington but were turned away. Tension grew as officials refused to meet Ames leaders or consider their proposals. Feeling disrespected and ignored, hundreds of protesters decided to take a bold stand. On November 3, 1972. After Wounded Knee, the American Indian movement stood at a crossroads. On one hand, it had captured international attention and rallied indigenous peoples around a renewed sense of pride and purpose. On the other, it now faced intense repression, internal fractures, and the challenge of turning symbolic victories into lasting change. The years that followed would test Ames' resilience, and ultimately reshape its influence. In the immediate aftermath of the 1973 occupation, federal law enforcement and the courts moved aggressively. AIM leaders like Dennis Banks and Russell Means were charged with conspiracy, assault, and other serious offenses. For months, the trial loomed over the movement, threatening lengthy prison sentences for its top figures. But in a dramatic twist, Judge Fred J. Nichol dismissed all charges in 1974, citing prosecutorial misconduct and noting that FBI agents had misled the court and altered documents. Though legally vindicated, Ames leaders were weakened. The long trials consumed energy and resources. Many chapters across the country fractured under pressure. The federal government continued to surveil and infiltrate AIM, sowing distrust among members. The movement's reputation in some quarters was tarnished, critics accused it of militancy, chaos, or mismanagement. Internal disagreements over strategy, leadership, and priorities deepened the fissures. Over time, Ames' national unity began to fray. The Pine Ridge Reservation, already a crucible of tension, became a site of escalating violence through the mid-1970s. Political conflict between supporters of Richard "Dick" Wilson, the tribal chairman, and traditionalist factions backed by AIM turned deadly. Many acts of violence, political killings, beatings, arson, were blamed on Wilson's private enforcers, the so-called goons, guardians of the Oglala Nation. Between 1973 and 1976, more than 60 murders were reported in the reservation, making Pine Ridge's murder rate among the highest in the United States at the time. Meanwhile, one of the most enduring and tragic legacies of this period is the case of Leonard Peltier. In 1975, 2 FBI agents were killed during a confrontation on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Peltier, an AIM member, was arrested, tried, and convicted of their murders. His trial has been criticized for alleged judicial irregularities, disputed evidence, and misconduct. Many supporters argue he was denied due process and that his prosecution was politically motivated. Peltier remains imprisoned to this day, a polarizing figure and symbol of federal injustice against indigenous peoples. Within AIM itself, divisions multiplied. Some chapters insisted on direct actions, occupations, and protest, others favored community programs, education, legal aid, health. Disagreements over funding, leadership style, and direction eroded cohesion. The FBI's tactics, infiltration, surveillance, disinformation, exacerbated mistrust. Some AIM activists turned